You are listening to The Brycen Show, episode 005 of the Religion Occult series. Aleister Crowley. Well, we're going to start off with some quotes from Aleister Crowley. This is given from brainyquote.com. The people who have really made history are the martyrs. The pious pretense that evil does not exist only makes it vague, enormous, and menacing. The supreme satisfaction is to be able to despise one's neighbor, and this fact goes far to account for religious intolerance. It is evidently consoling to reflect that the people next door are headed for hell. And a lot of this, actually, in a way, Aleister Crowley kind of cracks me up sometimes with the stuff he says. Because it does ring truth in some ways, but it's just, I don't know. And you always have to take it with a little bit of a sense of humor, I think. And I think a lot of people didn't really understand that. But still. Anyways. To me, a book is a message from the gods to mankind. Or if not, should never be published at all. Chinese civilization is so systematic that wild animals have been abolished on principle. Falsehood is invariably the child of fear in one form or another. I have never grown out of the infantile belief that the universe was made for me to suck. I slept with faith and found a corpse in my arms on awakening. I drank and danced all night with doubt and found her a virgin in the morning. I was asked to memorize what I did not understand, and, my memory being so good, it refused to be insulted in that manner. I was not content to believe in a personal devil and serve him, in the ordinary sense of the word. I wanted to get a hold of him personally and become his chief of staff. In the absence of willpower, the most complete collection of virtues and talents is wholly worthless. Magic is one of the subtlest and most difficult of the sciences and arts. There is more opportunity for errors of comprehension, judgment, and practice than in any other branch of physics. Modern morality and manners suppress all natural instincts, keep people ignorant of the facts of nature, and make them fighting drunk on bogey tales. I like this one. Science is always discovering odd scraps of magical wisdom and making a tremendous fuss about its cleverness. The conscience of the world is so guilty that it always assumes that people who investigate heresies must be heretics, just as if a doctor who studies leprosy must be a leper. Indeed, it is only recently that science has been allowed to study anything without reproach. The joy of life consists in the exercise of one's energies, continual growth, constant change, the enjoyment of every new experience. To stop means simply to die. The eternal mistake of mankind is to set up an attainable ideal. And lastly, the ordinary man looking at a mountain is like an illiterate person confronted with a Greek manuscript. And we'll go on to Wikipedia. Aleister Crowley, born Edward Alexander Crowley, and also known as both Frater Perturabo and the Great Beast 666, was an English occultist, mystic, ceremonial magician, poet, mountaineer, who is responsible for founding the religious philosophy of Thelema. In his role as the founder of the Thelemite philosophy, he came to see himself as the prophet who was entrusted with informing humanity that it was entering the new Aeon of Horus in the early 20th century. Born into a wealthy upper-class family as a young man, he became an influential member of the esoteric Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, after befriending the order's leader, Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers. We'll hear more about him. Subsequently, believing that he was being contacted by his holy guardian angel, an entity known as Ayahuasca, while staying in Egypt in 1904, he received a text known as the Book of the Law, from what he believed was a divine source, and around which he would come to develop his new philosophy of Thelema. He would go on to found his own occult society, the I don't even know what to call that symbol, A symbol, and eventually arose to become a leader of Oro Templi Orientis, or the OTO, before founding a religious commune in Cefalu known as the Abbey of Thelema, which he led from 1920 through 1923. After abandoning the abbey amid widespread opposition, Crowley returned to Britain, where he continued to promote Thelema until his death. Crowley was also pansexual, a recreational drug experimenter, and a social critic. In many of these roles, he was in revolt against the moral and religious values of his time, espousing a form of libertinism based upon the rule of do what thou wilt. Because of this, he gained widespread notoriety during his lifetime and was denounced in the popular press of the day as the wickedest man in the world. Crowley has remained an influential figure and is widely thought of as the most influential occultist of all time. In 2002, a BBC poll described him as being the 73rd greatest Briton of all time. References to him can be found in the works of numerous writers and musicians and filmmakers, and he has also been cited as a key influence on many later esoteric groups and individuals, including Kenneth Grant, Kenneth Anger, Jack Parsons, Gerald Gardner, Robert Anton Wilson, and to some degree, Austin Osmond Spare. Aleister was born as Edward Alexander Crowley at 30 Clarendon Square in Royal Leamington Spa, Warwickshire, England, between 11 p.m. and midnight on the 12th of October, 1875. His father, Edward Crowley, was trained as an engineer, but according to Aleister, never worked as one, instead owning shares in a lucrative family brewing business, Crowley's Alton Ales, which allowed him to retire before Aleister was born. His mother, Emily Bertha Bishop, drew roots from a Devonshire Somerset family and was despised by her son, whom she described as the Beast, a name that he reveled in. The couple had been married at Kensington Registry Office in London during November 1874. The Crowley family were Christian. Aleister's father had been born a Quaker, but had converted to the Exclusive Brethren, a more conservative faction of a denomination known as the Plymouth Brethren. Upon marriage, Emily had also converted to the Exclusive Brethren. Aleister's family was particularly devout, spending his time as a traveling preacher for the sect, and reading a chapter from the Bible to his wife and son after breakfast every day. Aged 8, Aleister was sent to H.T. Habershon's Evangelical Christian boarding school in Hastings, and then to a preparatory school in Cambridge, run by the Reverend Henry d'Arcy Champney, whom Aleister considered a sadist. On March 5, 1887, when Crowley was 11, his father died of tongue cancer. Aleister would describe this as a turning point in his life, and he always maintained some admiration for his father, describing him as his hero and his friend. Inheriting his father's wealth, he was subsequently sent to Eber School in Cambridge, a private Plymouth Brethren school, but was expelled for misbehavior. Following this, he attended Malvern College and then Tonbridge School, both of which he despised, and soon left after only a few terms, instead beginning studies at Eastbourne College. He became increasingly skeptical about Christianity, pointing out logical inconsistencies in the Bible to his religious teachers, and went against the Christian morality of his upbringing. For instance, embracing sex both with girls whom he met and by visiting female prostitutes, including one from which he contracted gonorrhea. For many years I had loathed being called Alec, partly because of the unpleasant sound and sight of the word, partly because it was the name by which my mother called me. Edward did not seem to suit me, and the diminutives Ted or Ned were even less appropriate. Alexander was too long, and Sandy suggested tow hair and freckles. I had read in some book or other that the most favorable name for becoming famous was one consisting of a dactyl followed by a spondee, as at the end of a hexameter, like Jeremy Taylor. Aleister Crowley fulfilled these conditions, and Aleister is the Gaelic form of Alexander. To adopt it would satisfy my romantic ideals. In 1895, Crowley, who soon adopted the new name of Aleister over his birth name of Edward, began a 3-year course at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he was entered for the moral science tripos, studying philosophy, but with approval from his personal tutor he switched to English literature, which was not then a part of the curriculum offered. Crowley largely spent his time at university engaged in his pastimes, one of which was mountaineering. He went on holidays to the Alps to do so every year from 1894 to 1898, and various other mountaineers who knew him at this time recognized him as a promising climber, although somewhat erratic. Another of his hobbies was writing poetry, which he had been doing since the age of 10, and in 1898 he privately published 100 copies of one of his poems, Aceldama, but it was not a particular success. That same year he published a string of other poems, the most notable of which was White Stains, a piece of erotica that had to be printed abroad as a safety measure in case it caused trouble with the British authorities. Part of this work, according to biographer Lawrence Sutton, deserves a place in any wide-ranging anthology of gay poetry. A third hobby of his was the game of chess, and he joined the university's chess club, where he later stated he beat the president in his first year and practiced 2 hours a day towards becoming a champion, but he eventually gave this idea up. It was while on a winter holiday in Sweden in December 1896 that he had his first significant mystical experience. Several later biographers, including Lawrence Sutton and Tobias Churton, believe that this was the result of Crowley's first homosexual experience. Following this experience, Crowley began to read up on the subject of occultism and mysticism, and by the next year he had begun reading books by alchemists and magicians. At university, he also maintained a vigorous sex life, which was largely conducted with prostitutes and girls he picked up at local pubs and cigar shops, but eventually he took part in same-sex activities, including receptive anal sex. This is despite the fact that homosexual acts were illegal and punishable with imprisonment at that time. In 1897, Crowley met a man named Herbert Charles Pollitt, the president of the Cambridge University Footlights Dramatic Club, and the two entered into a relationship, but broke up because Pollitt did not share Crowley's increasing interest in the esoteric. Crowley himself later stated that I told him frankly that I had given my life to religion, and that he did not fit into the scheme. I see now how imbecile I was, how hideously wrong and weak it is to reject any part of one's personality. In October, a brief illness triggered considerations of mortality and the futility of all human endeavor, or at least the futility of the diplomatic career that Crowley had previously considered, and instead he decided to devote his life to the occult. In 1897 he left Cambridge, not having taken any degree at all despite a first-class showing in his spring 1897 exams and consistent second-class honors. That summer he then traveled to St. Petersburg in Russia. Later biographers Richard Spence and Tobias Churton suggested that Crowley had done so under the employ of the British Secret Service, but this remains inconclusive. The Rosy Cross of the Golden Dawn, the organization that first introduced Crowley to the world of ceremonial magic. In 1898, Crowley was staying in Zermatt, Switzerland, where he met the chemist Julian Baker, and the two began talking about their common interest in alchemy. Upon their return to England, Baker introduced Crowley to George Cecil Jones, a member of the occult society known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which had been founded in 1888. Crowley was subsequently initiated into the Outer Order of the Golden Dawn on the 18th of November, 1898, by the group's leader, Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers. The ceremony itself took place at Mark Mason's Hall in London, where Crowley accepted his motto and magical name of Frater Perdurabo, a Latin term meaning "I shall endure to the end." Crowley moved from the elegant accommodation at the Hotel Cecil to his own luxury flat at 6769 Chancery Lane. He soon invited a Golden Dawn associate, Alan Bennett or Benet, I don't know, to live with him, and Benet became his personal tutor, teaching him more about ceremonial magic and the ritual usage of drugs. In 1900, Bennett left London for Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, to study Buddhism, while in 1899 Crowley acquired bullskin house in Foyers on the shore of Loch Ness in Scotland. He subsequently developed a love of Scottish culture, describing himself as the Laird of Bullskine, and took to wearing traditional Highland dress, even during visits back to London. However, a schism had developed in the Golden Dawn, with MacGregor Mathers, the organization's leader, being ousted by a group of members who were unhappy with his autocratic rule. Crowley had previously approached the group of rebels, asked to be initiated into the further orders of the Golden Dawn, but they had declined him. Unfazed, he went directly to Mathers, who still held the post of chief, and who agreed to initiate him into the Second Order. Now loyal to Mathers, Crowley, with the help of his then-mistress and fellow initiate, Elaine Simpson, attempted to help crush the rebellion and unsuccessfully tried to seize a London temple space known as the Vault of Rosencreutz from the rebels. We'll hear about the Rosicrucians and Christian Rosencreutz, which I don't really remember actually. In one of the earlier episodes, this might have been touched upon. Crowley had also developed personal feuds with some of the Golden Dawn's members. He disliked the poet W.B. Yeats, who had been one of the rebels, because Yeats had not been particularly favorable towards one of his own poems. He also disliked Arthur Edward Waite, who would rouse the anger of his fellows at the Golden Dawn with his pedantry. Crowley voiced the view that Waite was a pretentious bore through searing critiques of Waite's writings and editorials of other authors' writings. In his periodical, The Equinox, Crowley tiled one diatribe, "Wisdom while you wait," and his mock obituary on the passing of Waite bore the title, "Dead Waite." In 1900, Crowley traveled to Mexico via the United States on a whim, taking a local woman as his mistress, and with his good friend Oscar Eckenstein, proceeded to climb several mountains, including Iztaccíhuatl, Popocatépetl, and even Colima, the latter of which they had to abandon owing to a volcanic eruption. During this period, Eckenstein revealed mystical leanings of his own and told Crowley that he needed to improve the control of his mind, recommending the Indian practice of Raja Yoga in order to do so. Crowley had continued his magical experimentation on his own after leaving Mathers in the Golden Dawn, and his writings suggest he developed the magical word abrahadabra during this time, which I don't know how he could have developed that. It's been around, for a long time. But anyways, leaving Mexico, a country that he would always remain fond of, Crowley visited San Francisco, Hawaii, Japan, Hong Kong, and Cayman, where he met up with Alan Bennett and devoted himself further to yoga, from which he claimed to have achieved the spiritual state of dhyana. It was during this visit that Bennett decided to become a Buddhist monk in the Theravada tradition, traveling to Burma, while Crowley went on to India, studying various Hindu practices. In 1902, he was joined in India by Eckenstein and several other mountaineers, Guy Knowles, H. Fannell, V. Wesley, Dr. Jules Jacquet Guillermod. Together, the Eckenstein-Crowley expedition attempted to climb K2. On the journey, Crowley was afflicted with influenza, malaria, and snow blindness, while other expedition members were similarly struck with illness. They reached an altitude of 20,000 feet before deciding to turn back. In 1903, Crowley wed Rose Edith Kelly, the sister of his friend, the painter Gerald Festus Kelly, in a marriage of convenience. However, soon after their marriage, Crowley actually fell in love with her and set about to successfully prove his affections. Gerald Kelly was a good friend of W. Somerset Maugham, who, after briefly meeting Crowley, would later use him as a model for the protagonist of his novel, The Magician, published in 1908. In 1904, Crowley and his new wife Rose traveled to Egypt after the pseudonym of Prince and Princess Chao Khan, titles which Crowley claimed had been bestowed upon him by an Eastern potentate. According to Crowley's own account, Rose, who was pregnant, began to experience visions while in the country, regularly informing him that they are waiting for you, but not providing him with any further information as to who they were. It was on the 18th of March, after Crowley sought the aid of the Egyptian god Thoth in a magical rite, that she actually revealed who they were, the ancient Egyptian god Horus and his alleged messenger. She then led him to a nearby museum in Cairo, where she showed him a 7th century BCE mortuary still, known as the Still of Ankh-F-Unkhonsu. It later came to be revered in Thelema as the Still of Revealing. The Still of Revealing. Boy. Crowley was astounded, for the exhibit's number was 666, the number of the beast in Christian belief. Crowley took this all to be a sign from a divine entity, and on 20th of March began performing ritual invocations of the god Horus in his rented room. It was after this invocation that Rose, or as he now referred to her, Owarda, the seeress, informed him that the equinox of the gods had come. Had the manifestation of Nut, the unveiling of the company of heaven. Every man and woman is a star. Every number is infinite. There is no difference. Help me, O warrior lord of thieves, in my unveiling before the children of men. And this is the opening lines of Crowley's The Book of the Law. It was on the 8th of April, when the couple were still staying in Cairo, that Crowley first heard a disembodied voice talking to him, claiming that it was coming from a being known as Aiwass, the true nature of whom Crowley never understood. Crowley's disciple and later secretary Israel Regardie believed that this voice came from Crowley's subconscious, but opinions among Thelemites differ widely. Aiwass claimed to be a messenger from the god Horus, who was also referred to him by him as Hor-Par-Krat. Crowley wrote down everything the voice told him over the course of the next 3 days, and subsequently titled it Liber al-Veligis, or the Book of the Law. So Crowley was inside, you can almost call it a cave, for 3 days, and he was writing this, and then he came out with this great book. And here we go with these reoccurring themes. But anyways, the God's commands explained that a new aeon for mankind had begun, and that Crowley would serve as its prophet. As a supreme moral law, it declared, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and that people should learn to live in tune with their true will. Although this event would prove to be a cornerstone in Crowley's life, being the origin of the philosophy of Thelema, at the time he was unsure what to think about the whole situation. He was dumbfounded about what to do with the Book of the Law, and eventually decided to ignore the instructions that it commanded him to perform, which included taking the Still of Revealing from the museum, fortifying his own island, and translating the book into all the world's languages. Instead, he simply sent typescripts of the work to several occultists who he knew, and then put aside the book with relief. Returning to Boleskine, Crowley came to believe, for reasons that are documented in Crowley's diaries, that his former friend Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers had become so jealous of his progression as a ceremonial magician that he had begun using magic against him, and the relationship between the two broke down. On July 28, 1905, Rose gave birth to Crowley's first child, a daughter whom he named Nuit Ma Ahathor, Hecate Sappho Jezebel Lilith, although she would kindly be referred to simply by her last name. Can you imagine naming your kid that? Nuit Ma Ahathor, Hecate Sappho Jezebel Lilith. He also founded a publishing company, naming it the Society for the Propagation of Religious Truth, in parody of the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, and through this released more of his own poetry, including The Sword of Song. While his poetry often received strong reviews, either positive or negative, it never sold well, and attempting to gain more publicity, he issued a reward of £100 for whomever could write the best essay on the topic of his work. The winner of this would prove to be J.F.C. Fuller, a British Army officer and military historian whose essay, The Star in the West, heralded Crowley's poetry as some of the greatest ever written. Crowley decided to climb another of the world's greatest mountains, and for this chose Kangchenjunga in the Himalayas, widely thought of as the most treacherous mountain in the world by climbers at the time. Assembling a team consisting of Dr. Jaykat Gulermad, a veteran of the K2 climb, as well as several other continental Europeans, including Charles Adolphe Raymond, Alexis Pache, and Alceste C. Rigo de Rigi. The group traveled to British India to undertake the task. Throughout the expedition, there was much argument between Crowley and the others who felt that he was reckless. They eventually mutinied against Crowley's control, and the other climbers heading back down the mountain as nightfall approached, despite Crowley's warnings that it was too dangerous. Crowley was proved right as Pache, and several porters were subsequently killed in an accident. That's freaking weird. Returning from this expedition, he met up with Rose and Lilith in Kolkata before being forced to leave India after shooting dead a native who had tried to mug him. Traveling to China, Crowley soon fell down a 40-foot cliff, finding himself unscathed. He believed that he was being protected for some prophetic purpose, and underwent a religious experience that he felt bestowed on him the rank of exempt adept, the highest grade of the second order of the Golden Dawn. Devoting himself fully to spiritual and magical work, he began studying the Goetia, and recited the grimoire's preliminary invocation daily in order to try to get in contact with his holy guardian angel. And Goetia is basically a magic system that's based on the lesser and the greater keys of Solomon. And we'll go into that at a later time. I'll probably even read through them. But that's what that's all based on. The Crowleys spent the next few months traveling around China, but it was decided that in March 1906 they would return to Britain. Rose took Lilith with her and set off for Europe via India, while Crowley himself decided to travel back through the United States, where he hoped he would be able to get support for a second expedition to the mountain they had just climbed. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name again. Before departing, Crowley visited his friend Elaine Simpson in Shanghai, a fellow occultist who had been his colleague in the Golden Dawn. She was fascinated by the Book of the Law and the prophetic message that it contained, something he had been ignoring, and together they performed a ritual to invoke Ayahuasca once more. The ritual proved successful, and Ayahuasca provided Crowley with the message that he should return to Egypt with same surroundings. There I will give 3 signs. These signs. Nonetheless, Crowley ignored the advice of Ayahuasca, instead heading off to America. Stopping off at the Japanese port of Kobe along the way, Crowley had a vision which he interpreted as meaning that the great spiritual beings known as the Secret Chiefs had admitted him into the Third Order of the Golden Dawn. Subsequently, arriving in America, he found no support for his proposed mountaineering expedition, and so set sail to return to Britain, arriving there in June 1906. The AA and the Holy Books of Thelema. Upon arrival at Britain, Crowley learned that his daughter, Lilith, had died of typhoid in Rangoon, and that his wife had begun suffering from alcoholism. Heartbroken, his health began to suffer, and he underwent a series of surgical operations. He began having a short-lived sexual affair with Vera Lola Stepp, an actress to whom he would devote some of his poetry, while Rose gave birth to his second daughter, Lola Zaza, for whom Crowley devised a special ritual of thanksgiving. Believing that he was now amongst the highest level of spiritual adepts, Crowley began to think about founding his own magical society. In this he was supported by his friend and fellow occultist George Cecil Jones. The pair began to practice rituals together at Jones' home in Colesden, and for the autumn equinox on 22nd of September 1907 developed a new ceremony based on the Golden Dawn initiatory rite, for which Crowley composed a verse liturgy entitled Liber 671 and later dubbed Liber Pyramidos. The pair repeated this ritual again on 9th of October when they had made some alterations to it. In Crowley's eyes, his ritual would prove to be one of the greatest events of his career, during which he attained the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel, and entered the trance of Samadhi, union with Godhead. He therefore finally succeeded with the aim of his Abramelin operation, as set out in the grimoire known as the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, which he had been working on for months. Because of his spiritual attainment, Crowley came to believe that he could finally enter into conversation with his holy guardian angel, the entity known as Ayahuasca, and as a result of this, on the 30th of October 1907, penned Liber 7, a text that he believed to have been dictated to him by Ayahuasca through automatic writing. Following the Book of the Law, which had been received in 1904, Liber 7 would prove to be the second book in a series of holy books of Thelema. Over the next few days, he also received a further holy book, Liber Cordis Sancti Serpente. Soon, Crowley, Jones, and J.F.C. Fuller decided to found a new magical order as a successor to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which would be known as the A something, the Argenteum, Astrum, or the Silver Star. Following the order's foundation, Crowley continued to write down more received Thelemic holy books during the last 2 months of the year, including Liber I guess that would be Liber something 16, Liber Arcanorum, Liber Porta Lucis, Sub Figura X, Liber Ta, Liber Trigrammaton, and Liber Vel Ararita. Meanwhile, effectively separated from his wife Rose by this point, Crowley entered into a romantic and sexual affair with Ada Leverson, an author and friend of Oscar Wilde. This affair was brief, and in February 1908, Crowley was reunited with his wife as she had overcome her alcoholism, and together the couple traveled to Eastbourne for a holiday. Rose, however, relapsed, and Crowley, who disliked her when drunk, fled to Paris. In 1909, when doctors stated that Rose required institutionalization for her alcoholism, Crowley finally decided that it was time to get a divorce. But because he didn't want the proceedings to reflect badly upon her, he agreed that she could divorce him for infidelity, thereby meaning that any bad appearances would instead be reflected upon him, and he remained her friend following the proceedings. Trying to gain more members, Crowley decided to begin publishing a biannual journal, the Equinox, which is billed as the Review of Scientific Illuminism. Starting with a first issue in 1909, the Equinox Scientific Illuminism, keep that in mind. Starting with a first issue in 1909, the Equinox contained pieces of Crowley, Fuller, and a young poet Crowley had met in 1907 named Victor Newberg. Soon other occultists had joined the order, including solicitor Richard Noel Warren, artist Austin Osmond Spare, Horace Sheridan Bickers, George Rafalovich, Francis Henry Everard Joseph Fielding, engineer Herbert Edward Inman, Kenneth Ward, and Charles Jones. In 1907, Crowley had been introduced to a Jewish Londoner named Victor Newberg, a poet who was interested in the esoteric. In Paris, during October 1908, he again produced Samadhi, which was that mental state that he was in when he met his guardian angel through the Abremlin the Mage book. By the use of ritual, and this time did so without hashish, to be hash. He published an account of this success in order to show that his method worked and that one could achieve great mystical results without living as a hermit. On December 30th, 1908, Aleister Crowley began using the pseudonym Oliver Haydoe, made accusations of plagiarism against Somerset Maugham, author of the novel The Magician. Crowley's article appeared in Vanity Fair, edited then by Frank Harris, who admired Crowley, and who would later write the famous work My Life and Loves. Admittedly, Maugham did model the character of his magician, Oliver Haydoe, after Crowley himself, and Crowley stated that Maugham acquiesced privately on the question of plagiarism. In 1909, Crowley and Rose divorced, largely due to her alcoholism. She was subsequently admitted to an asylum suffering from alcoholic dementia. Meanwhile, Crowley soon moved on and took a woman named Lila Waddell as his lover, or the Scarlet Woman. In 1910, Crowley performed his series of dramatic rites, the Rites of Eleusis, which we've heard about before, with the AA members Lila Waddell and Victor Benjamin Newberg. And that's funny because he was known as the Great Beast, and he took his wife and called her the Scarlet Woman, which, whatever that means, it's still quite interesting. According to Crowley, Theodore Roos called on him in 1912 to accuse him of publishing OTO secrets, which Crowley dismissed on the grounds of having never attained the grade in which these secrets were given. Roos opened up Crowley's latest book, The Book of Lies, and showed Crowley the passage. This sparked a long conversation which led to Crowley assuming the 10th degree of OTO and becoming Grand Master of the English-speaking section of the OTO called the Mysteria Mystica Maxima. Crowley would eventually introduce the practice of male homosexual sex magic into the OTO as one of the highest degrees of the order, for he believed it to be the most powerful formula. Crowley placed the new degree above the 10th degree, not to be confused with any title in his own order, and numbered it the 11th degree. There was a protest from some members of the OTO in Germany and the rest of continental Europe that occasioned a persistent rift with Crowley. In March 1913, producer Crowley introduced Layla Waddell in the Ragtime Girls Follies review at the Old Tivoli in London, where it enjoyed a brief run. In July 1913, the production enjoyed a 6-week run in Moscow, where Crowley met a young Hungarian girl named Annie Ringler. Crowley went on to practice sadomasochistic sex with Ringler. According to Crowley, she had passed beyond the region where pleasure had meaning for her. She could only feel through pain, and my own means of making her happy was to inflict physical cruelties as she directed. The kind of relation was altogether new to me, and it was because of this, intensified as it was by the environment of the self-torturing soul of Russia, that I became inspired to create by the next 6 weeks. While in Moscow, Crowley would see Annie for an hour, and then he would write poetry. During the summer in Moscow, Crowley would write 2 of his most memorable works, the Hymn to Pan and the Gnostic Mass, or Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica Canon Massae. The Hymn to Pan would be read at his funeral 34 years later. Certain Thelemites regularly perform the Gnostic Mass to this day. It symbolizes the act of sex as a magical or religious ritual. Upon returning to London in the autumn of 1913, Crowley published the 10th and final number of Volume 1 of the Equinox. In December 1913 in Paris, Crowley would engage Victor Benjamin Newberg in the Paris Working. The first ritual took place on New Year's Eve, 1914. In a period of 7 weeks, Crowley and Newberg performed a total of 24 rituals, which they recorded in the Holy, or Partially Holy Book, formerly entitled Opus Lutetianum. Around 8 months later, Newberg had a nervous breakdown. Afterward, Crowley and Newberg would never see each other again. During his time in the U.S., Crowley practiced the task of a Magister Templi in the AA, as he conceived it, namely interpreting every phenomenon as a particular dealing of God with his soul. He began to see various women he met as officers in his ongoing initiation, associating them with priests wearing animal masks and Egyptian ritual. A meditation during his relationship with one of these women, the poet Jean Robert Foster, led him to claim the title of Magus, also referring to the system of the AA. In June 1915, Crowley met Jean Robert Foster in the company of her friend Helen Hollis, a journalist. Crowley would have affairs with both women. Foster was a famous New York fashion model, journalist, editor, poet, and married. Crowley's plan with Foster was to produce his first son, but in spite of a series of magical operations, she did not get pregnant. By the end of 1915, the affair would be over. During a trip to Vancouver in 1915, Crowley met Wilfred Smith, Freighter 132 of the Vancouver Lodge of the OTO, and in 1930 granted him permission to establish a Agape Lodge in Southern California. During the same trip in 1915, Crowley stopped over at Park Davis in Detroit for some mescaline. In early 1916, Crowley had an illicit liaison with Alice Richardson. Hold on just a second. The wife of Ananda Kumaraswamy, one of the greatest art historians of the day. On the stage, Richardson was known as Ratan Devi, mezzo-soprano interpreter of East Indian music. Richardson became impregnated, but on a voyage back to England in mid-1916, she had a miscarriage. Just before his affair with Ratan Devi, Crowley was practicing sex magic with Gerda Maria von Kothek, a German prostitute. 2 periods of magical experimentation followed. In June 1916, he began the first of these at the New Hampshire cottage of Evangeline Adams, having ghostwritten most of her 2 books on astrology. Her diaries at first showed discontent at the gap between his view of the grade of Magus the grade of his Magan and his view of himself. It is no good making up my mind to do anything material, for I have no means, but this would vanish if I could make up my mind. Despite his objections to sacrificing a living animal, he resolved to crucify a frog as part of a rehearsal of the life of Jesus in the Gospels, afterward declaring it his willing familiar, with the idea that some supreme violation of all the laws of my being would break down my karma or dissolve the spell that seems to bind me. Slightly more than a month later, having taken ethyl oxide, he had a vision of the universe from a modern scientific cosmology that he frequently referred to in later writings. Crowley began another period of magical work on an island in the Hudson River after buying large amounts of red paint instead of food. Having painted "Do What Thou Wilt" on the cliffs at both sides of the island, he received gifts from curious visitors. Here at the island he had visions of seeming past lives, though he refused to endorse any theory of what they meant, beyond linking them to his unconscious. Towards the end of his stay, he had a shocking experience he linked to the Chinese wisdom, which made even Thelema appear insignificant. Nevertheless, he continued in his work. Before leaving the country, he formed a sexual and magical relationship with Lee Hersig, whom he had met earlier, and with her help began painting canvases with more creativity and passion. Richard Spence writes in 2008 book Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult, that Crowley could have been a lifelong agent for British intelligence. While this may have already been the case, during his many travels to Tsarist Russia, Switzerland, Asia, Mexico, and North Africa that had started in his student's days, he could have been involved with this line of work during his life in America during the First World War, under a cover of being a German propaganda agent and a supporter of Irish independence. Crowley's mission might have been to gather information about the German intelligence network, the Irish independent activists, and produce aberrant propaganda aiming at compromising the German and Irish ideals. As an agent provocateur, he could have played some role in provoking the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, thereby bringing the United States closer to active involvement in the war alongside the Allies. He also used German magazines, the Fatherland and the International, as outlets for his other writings. The question of whether Crowley was a spy has always been subject to debate, but Spence uncovered a document from the U.S. Army's Old Military Intelligence Division supporting Crowley's own claim to have been a spy. Soon after moving from West 9th Street in Greenwich Village, New York City, to Palermo, Sicily, with their newborn daughter Anne Lee, nicknamed Poopy, born February 1920, died in a hospital in Palermo 14 October. Crowley, along with Lee Hersig, founded the Abbey of Thelema. Crowley used, during their stay at the Abbey, Hersig was known as Soror Alostriel, Crowley's Scarlet Woman, the name Crowley used for his female sex magic partners, in reference to the consort of the beast of the Apocalypse. The name of the abbey was borrowed from Rabelais' epic Gargantua, where the Abbey of Thelema is described as a sort of anti-monastery, where the lives of the inhabitants were spent not in laws, statutes, or rules, but according to their own free will and pleasure. The idealistic utopia was to be the model of Crowley's commune, while also being a type of magical school, giving it the designation Collegium ad Spiritum Sanctum, the College of the Holy Spirit. The general program was in line with the AA course of training and included daily adorations to the sun, a study of Crowley's writings, regular yogic and ritual practices, which were to be recorded, as well as general domestic labor. The object, naturally, was for students to devote themselves to the great work of discovering and manifesting their true wills. Two women, Hersig and Shumway, were both carrying Crowley's seed. Hersig had a 2-year-old son named Hansi, and Shumway had a 3-year-old boy named Howard. They were not Crowleys, but he nicknamed them Dionysius and Hermes, respectively. After Poupée died, Hersig had a miscarriage, but Shumway gave birth to a daughter, Astarte Lulu Panthea. Hersig suspected Shumway's black magic, foul play, and what Crowley found when reading Shumway's magical diary appalled him. Shumway was banished from the abbey, and the beast lamented the death of his children. However, Shumway was soon back in the abbey again to take care of her offspring. Here's an interesting... Anyways, February 1924. Crowley visited Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. He did not meet the founder on that occasion, but called Gurdjieff a tip-top man in his diary. Crowley privately criticized some of the Institute's practices and teachings, but doubted that what he heard from disciple Pindar reflected the master's true position. Some claim that on a later visit he met Gurdjieff, who firmly repudiated Crowley. I just cannot read today. Biographer Sutton expresses skepticism, and Gurdjieff's student C.S. Knott tells a different version. Knott perceives Crowley as a black or at least ignorant magician and says his teacher kept a sharp watch on the visitor, but mentions no open confrontation. On the 16th of August, 1929, Crowley married Maria de Miramar, or a Nicaraguan, while in Leipzig. They separated by 1930 but were never divorced. In July 1931, de Miramar was admitted to the Colney Hatch Mental Hospital in New Southgate, where she remained until her death 30 years later. In September 1930, Crowley was in Lisbon to meet the poet Fernando Pessoa, who translated his poem Hymn to Pan into Portuguese. With the assistance of Pessoa, Crowley faked his own death at a notorious rock formation on the shore called Boca do Inferno. Crowley then left the country and enjoyed the newspaper reports of his death, and reappeared 3 weeks later at an exhibition in Berlin. In 1934, Crowley was declared bankrupt after losing a court case in which he sued the artist Nina Hammett for calling him a black magician in her 1932 book, Laughing Torso. In addressing the jury, Mr. Justice Swift said, "I have been over 40 years engaged in the administration of the law in one capacity or another. I thought that I knew of every conceivable form of wickedness. I thought that everything which was vicious and bad had been produced at one time or another before me. I have learnt in this case that we can always learn something more if we live long enough. I have never heard such dreadful, horrible, blasphemous, and abominable stuff as that which has been produced by the man Crowley, who describes himself to you as the greatest living poet." Patricia McAlpine approached Crowley on the day of the verdict and offered to bear him a child, whom he named Aleister Ataturk. She sought no mystical or religious role in Crowley's life and rarely saw him after the birth, an arrangement that suited them both. In March 1939, Dion Fortune and Aleister Crowley met publicly for the first time. Fortune had already used Crowley as a model for the black magician Hugo Astley in her 1935 novel The Winged Bull. During the Second World War, future James Bond author Ian Fleming, then a Navy intelligence officer, along with other colleagues, proposed a disinformation plot in which Crowley would have helped an MI5 agent supply Nazi official Rudolf Hess with faked horoscopes. They could then pass along false information about an alleged pro-German circle in Britain. The government abandoned this plan when Hess flew to Scotland, crashing his plane on the moors near Eaglesham and was captured. Fleming then suggested using Crowley as an interrogator to determine the influence of astrology on other Nazi leaders, but his superiors rejected this plan. At some point, Fleming also suggested that Britain could use Enochian as a code in order to plant evidence, and I think we've talked about Enochian, the Enochian language. If we haven't, I'm sure we'll get into it at a later time. On the 21st of March, 1944, Crowley undertook what he considered his crowning achievement, the publication of the Book of Thoth, strictly limited to 200 numbered and signed copies, bound in Morocco leather and printed on pre-wartime paper. Crowley sold £1,500 worth of the edition in less than 3 months. In April of 1944, Crowley moved from 93 German St. Street to Bell Inn at Ashton Clinton, Bucks. Daphne Harris was the landlady. In January 1945, Crowley moved to Netherwood, a Hastings boarding house where in the first 3 months he was visited twice by Dion Fortune. She died of leukemia in January 1946. On the 14th of March, 1945, in a letter Fortune wrote to Crowley, she declares, "The acknowledgment I made in the introduction of the mystical Kabbalah of my indebtedness to your work, which seemed to me to be no more than common literary honesty, has been used as a rod for my back by people who look on you as Antichrist." Crowley died at Netherwood on the 1st of December 1947 at the age of 72. According to one biographer, their cause of death was a respiratory infection. See, we're getting the same numbers. It's just weird how those numbers always work out. The age of 72. According to one biographer, the cause of death was a respiratory infection. He had become addicted to heroin after being prescribed morphine for his asthma and bronchitis many years earlier. He and his last doctor died within 24 hours of each other. Newspapers would claim, in differing accounts, that Dr. Thompson had refused to continue his opiate prescription, and that Crowley had put a curse on him. Biographer Lawrence Sutton passes on various stories about Crowley's death and last words. Frietta Harris supposedly reported him saying, "I am perplexed," though she did not see him at the very end. According to John Simmons, a Mr. Rowe witnessed Crowley's death along with a nurse, and reported his last words as, "Sometimes I hate myself." Biographer Gerald Suster accepted the versions of events he received from a Mr. W.H., who worked at the house in which Crowley dies, pacing in his living room. Mr. W.H. heard a crash while polishing furniture on the floor below and entered Crowley's room to find him dead on the floor. Patricia McAlpine, who visited Crowley with their son and her 3 children, denied all this and reports a sudden gust of wind and a peal of thunder at the otherwise quiet moment of his death. According to McAlpine, Crowley remained bedridden for the last few days of his life, but was in light spirits and conversational. Readings at the cremation service in nearby Brycen included excerpts from Crowley's works, among them his poem Hymn to Pan, and newspapers referred to the service as a black mass. The Brycen Council subsequently resolved to take all the necessary steps to prevent such an incident from occurring again. Thelema is the mystical cosmology Crowley announced in 1904 and expanded upon for the remainder of his life. The diversity of his writings illustrate his difficulty in classifying Thelema from any one vantage. It can be considered a form of magical philosophy, religious traditionalism, humanistic positivism, and or an elitist meritocracy. The chief precept of Thelema derived from the works of Francois Rabelais and the sovereignty of the will. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Crowley's idea of will, however, is not simply the individual's desires or wishes, but also incorporates a sense of the person's destiny or greater purpose, what he termed true will. So really, people like to try to scare you with that do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law type thing, but really, if you really read the writings of it, it means your true will or your destiny. So do what thou wilt would be like do what you're supposed to do. The second precept of Thelema is love is the law, love under will. And Crowley's meaning of love is as complex as that of will. It is frequently sexual. Crowley's system, like elements of the Golden Dawn before him, sees the dichotomy and tension between the male and female as fundamental to existence, and sexual magic and metaphor form a certain part of Thelemic ritual. However, love is also discussed as the union of opposites, which Crowley thought was the key to enlightenment. The union of opposites, which Crowley thought was the key to enlightenment. We have heard of this stuff before. He had also claimed to be a Freemason, but the organizations he joined are not considered regular by Masonic bodies in the Anglo-American tradition. Crowley claimed the following Masonic degrees: 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite in Mexico from Don Jesus Medina. Don Jesus Medina, a descendant of the great Duke of Armada fame, and one of the highest chiefs of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. My Kabbalistic knowledge being already profound by current standards, he thought me worthy of the highest initiation in his power to confer. Special powers were obtained in view of my limited sojourn, and I was pushed rapidly through and admitted to the 33rd and the last degree before I left the country. 3rd degree in France by the Anglo-Saxon Lodge, number 343, a lodge chartered in 1899 by the Grand Lodge de France, a body not at the time recognized by the United Grand Lodge of England. 33rd degree of the Irregular Carno, Scottish Rite, from John Yarker. 90th degree and the 95th degree of the Rite of Memphis, from John Yarker. The United Grand Lodge of England, whose recognition is generally considered the standard for Masonic validity, did not recognize any of the above bodies as being true Freemasonry. Thus Crowley never was an official Freemason, within the common understanding of the term. Crowley quickly realized that the post-Yarker era meant change. He was not rebellious by reflex, at least where old British institutions were concerned. He undoubtedly believed OTO, or the Ordo Templis Orienti, whatever it's called, had authority from Yarker to work the ancient and primitive rites equivalent to the craft degrees in England, but once made aware of the issue of regularity, when having his own French Masonic credentials declined, he was not defiant, and on his own made changes to the OTO to avoid conflict. He inserted notices into the last number of the Equinox to the effect that the OTO did not infringe upon the just privileges of the Grand Lodge of England. During World War I, Crowley worked slightly revised English craft rituals in America, but despite the absence of a central Grand Lodge, he met with objections from Masonic authorities. He then rewrote the OTO rituals for the first degree to the third degree so that they no longer resembled craft masonry degrees in language, theme, or intent. So here you have the leaders of Freemasonry stepping in and saying that his rituals, at least the first three, were way too close to theirs. Crowley endeavored to use the scientific method to study what people at the time called spiritual experiences, making the method of science the aim of religion, the catchphrase of his magazine The Equinox. By this he meant that religious experiences should not be taken at face value, but critiqued and experimented with in order to arrive at their underlying mystical or neurological meaning, or in other words, the exoteric and the esoteric, which he learned about earlier. In this connection, there was also the point that this must be a quote from him or something. In this connection, there was also the point that I was anxious to prove that spiritual progress did not depend on religious or moral codes, but was like any other science. Magic would yield its secrets to the infidel and the libertine, just as one does not have to be a church warden in order to discover a new kind of orchid. There are, of course, certain virtues necessary to the magician, but they are of the same order as those which make a successful chemist. He frequently expressed views about sex that were radical for his time, and published numerous poems and tracts combining religious themes with sexual imagery, both heterosexual and homosexual, as well as pederastic. One of his most notorious poetry collections, titled White Stains, was published in Amsterdam in 1898 and dealt specifically with sexually explicit subject matter. However, most of the 100 copies printed for the initial release were later seized and destroyed by British customs. Crowley's magical and initiatory system has amongst its innermost reaches a set of teachings on sex magic. Sex magic is the use of the sex act or the energies, passions, or arousal states as a point upon which to focus the will or magical desire for effects in the non-sexual world. In the view of Allen Greenfield, Crowley was inspired by Paschal Beverly Randolph, an American abolitionist, spiritualist medium and author of the mid-19th century, who wrote of using the nuptive moment, or the orgasm, as a time to make a prayer, or events to occur. Crowley often introduced new terminology for spiritual and magical practices and theory. In the Book of the Law and the Vision and the Voice, the Aramaic magical formula abracadabra was changed to abrahadabra, which he called the new formula of the Aeon. He also famously spelled magic in the archaic manner, as magic with a K, to differentiate the true science of the Magi from all its counterfeits. He urged his students to learn to control their own mental and behavioral habits, to the point of switching political views and personalities at will. For control of speech, he recommended to choose a commonly used word, letter, or pronouns and adjectives of the first person, such as the word I, and avoid using it for a week or more. Should they say the word, he instructed them to cut themselves with a blade on each occasion to serve as a warning or reminder. Later, the student would move on to the horse of action and the ox of thought. These symbols derive from the Kabbalah. Crowley had also been labeled by some anthropologists as a practitioner of neo-shamanism and revivalist of shamanistic philosophies in the early 20th century. Crowley enjoyed being a figure of controversy and frequently, deliberately provoked it among his peers and in the media. Author and Crowley expert Lon Milo Duquette wrote in his 1993 work, The Magic of Aleister Crowley, that Crowley clothed many of his teachings in the thin veil of sensational titillation. By doing so, he assured himself that 1. His works would only be appreciated by the few individuals capable of doing so, and 2. His works would continue to generate interest and be published by and for the benefit of both his admirers and his enemies long after death. He did not, I repeat, not perform or advocate human sacrifice. He was often guilty, however, of the crime of poor judgment. Like all of us, Crowley had many flaws and shortcomings. The greatest of those, in my opinion, was his inability to understand that everyone else in the world was not as educated and clever as he. It is clear, even in his earliest works, he often took fiendish delight in terrifying those who were either too lazy, too bigoted, or too slow-witted to understand him. And here you see the classic, it's just like the studies of the mystery schools. There's like an exoteric mythology, myth, whatever, but there's actually things hidden inside of it, which is the real point of it. And then this comes from Layla Waddell, Crowley's muse during the writing of the Book of Lies. In this vein, many of Crowley's more audacious and outright shocking writings were often thinly veiled attempts to communicate methods of sexual magic, often using words like blood, death, and kill to replace semen, ecstasy, and ejaculation, in the yet puritanical sexual environment of late 19th, early 20th century. Take, for instance, the highly repeated quote from his thickly veiled Book 4. It would be unwise to condemn as irrational the practice of devouring the heart and liver of an adversary while yet warm. For the highest spiritual working, one must choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory. No matter how you cut it, I'm going to cut away from the reading. I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of at a split when interpreting some of this, because some of it is outright, like, you can tell that symbology is used and there's obviously hidden meaning, but stuff like that, like this from Book 4, I'll quote it again. It would be unwise to condemn as irrational the practice of devouring the heart and liver of an adversary while yet warm. For the highest spiritual working, one must choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory. Robert Anton Wilson is an author. In his 1977, The Final Secret of the Illuminati, interpreted the child as a reference to genes in sperm. Crowley added in a footnote to the text on sacrifice, the intelligence and innocence of that male child are the perfect understanding of the magician, his one aim, without lust of result. In the new comment to the Book of the Law, the B666 advises that all children shall be accustomed from infancy to witness every type of sexual act, as also the process of birth, lest falsehood, fog, and mystery stupefy their minds. Politeness has forbidden any direct reference to the subject of sex to secure no happier result than to allow Sigmund Freud and others to prove that our every thought, speech, and gesture, conscious or unconscious, is an indirect reference. Crowley was a habitual drug user and also maintained a meticulous record of his drug-induced experiences with opium, cocaine, hash, cannabis, alcohol, ether, mescaline, morphine, and heroin. Alan Bennett, Crowley's mentor, was said to have instructed Crowley in the magical use of drugs. The Cairo revelation from ayahuasca specifically recommended indulgence in strange drugs. While in Paris during the 1920s, Crowley experimented with psychedelic substances, specifically anhelonium lawini, an obsolete scientific name for the mescaline-bearing cactus peyote, and initiated the writers Catherine Mansfield and Theodore Dresser in his use. In October 1930, Crowley dined with Aldous Huxley in Berlin, and to this day rumors persist that he introduced Huxley to peyote on that occasion. Crowley developed a drug addiction after a London doctor prescribed heroin for his asthma and bronchitis. His life as an addict influenced his 1922 novel, Diary of a Drug Fiend, where the fiction presented a hopeful outcome of rehabilitation and recovery by means of magical techniques and the exercise of true will. He overcame his addiction to heroin during this period, but began taking it once more late in his life, again on doctor's prescription for his respiratory difficulties. Let's see. Biographer Lawrence Sutton stated that blatant bigotry is a persistent minor element in Crowley's writings. He also calls Crowley a spoiled scion of a wealthy Victorian family who embodied many of the worst John Bull racial and social prejudices of his upper-class contemporaries, noting that Crowley embodied the contradiction that writhed within many Western intellectuals of the time, deeply held racist viewpoints, courtesy of their culture, coupled with a fascination with people of color. Crowley's public expressions of anti-Semitism were disturbing enough to later editors of his works that one of them, Israel Regardie, who had also been a student of Crowley, attempted to suppress them. In 777 and other Kabbalistic writings of Crowley, Regardie, who was Jewish, explained his complete removal of Crowley's anti-Semitic commentary on the Kabbalah in the 6th unnumbered page of his editorial introduction. I am omitting Crowley's preface to the book. It is a nasty, malicious piece of writing and does not do justice to the system with which he is dealing. What Regardie had removed was Crowley's preface to the Sefer Sephiroth, originally published in Equinox 1 verse 8, written in 1911, which contained a statement of Crowley's belief in the blood libel against the Jews. Human sacrifices are still practiced by the Jews of Eastern Europe, as is set forth at length by Sir Richard Burton in the manuscript which the wealthy Jews of England have compassed heaven and earth to suppress, and evidenced by the ever-recurring pogroms against which so senseless an outcry is made by those who live among those degenerate Jews who are at least not cannibals. Crowley rhetorically asked how a system of values such as Kabbalah could come from what the general position of the ethnologists called an entirely barbarous race, devoid of any spiritual pursuit, and polytheists to boot. As Crowley himself practiced polytheism, some read these remarks as deliberate irony. Crowley studied and promoted the mystical and magical teachings of some of the same ethnic groups he attacked, in particular Indian Yoga, Jewish Kabbalah, and the Goetia, and the Chinese I Ching. Also in Confessions, chapter 86, as well as a private diary which Lawrence Sutton quotes in Do What Thou Wilt, chapter 7. Crowley recorded a memory of a past life as the Chinese Taoist writer Ku Husuan. In another remembered life, Crowley said, he took part in a council of masters that included many from Asia. He has this to say about the virtues of Eurasians and Jews. I do not believe that their universally admitted baseness is due to a mixture of blood or the presumable peculiarity of their parents, but that they are forced into vileness by the attitude of both their white and colored neighbors. A similar case is presented by the Jew, who really does only too often possess the bad qualities for which he is disliked, but they are not proper to his race. No people can show finer specimens of humanity. The Hebrew poets and prophets are sublime. The Jewish soldier is courageous, the Jewish man generous. The race possesses imagination, romance, loyalty, probity, and humanity at an exceptional degree. But the Jew has been persecuted so relentlessly that his survival has depended on the development of his worst qualities: avarice, servility, falseness, cunning, and the rest. Even the highest class Eurasians, such as Yananda Kumaraswamy, suffer acutely from the shame of being considered outcast. The irrationality and injustice of their neighbors heightens the feeling, and it breeds the very abominations which the snobbish inhumanity of their fellow men expects of them. All these remarks must necessarily be contrasted with Crowley's explicit philosophical instructions in his last book, Magic Without Tears, which we'll be reading from a little bit later, chapter 73, which is entitled Monsters, Niggers, Jews, etc., and which states his essentially individualist and anti-racialist views. You say, every man and every woman is a star. Does need some attention to the definition of man and woman? What is the position, you say, of monsters, and men of inferior races like the Veda, Hottentot, and Australian blackfellow? There must be a line somewhere, and will I please draw it? Not only does it seem to me the only conceivable way of reconciling this and similar passages with every man and every woman is a star, to assert the sovereignty of the individual and to deny the right to exist to class consciousness, crowd psychology, and so to mob rule and lynch law, but also the only practicable plan whereby we may each one of us settle down peaceably to mind his own business, to pursue his true will, and to accomplish the great work. The Thelemic philosophical position which he taught in this volume is clearly an anti-racist one. Even in private comments on Mein Kampf, Crowley said that his own preferred master class was above all distinctions of race. And let's see. We'll go skip ahead in this article. Fictionalized, and we'll go to popular culture. Fictionalized accounts of Crowley, or characters based upon him, have been included in a number of literary works, published both during his life and after. The writer W. Somerset Maugham used him as the model for the character in his novel The Magician, published in 1908. Crowley was flattered by Maugham's fictionalized depiction of himself, stating that he had done more than justice to the qualities of which I was proud. The Magician was, in fact, an appreciation of my genius, such as I had never dreamed of inspiring. Similarly, in Dennis Wheatley's popular thriller The Devil Rides Out, the satanic cult leader Mokata is inspired by Crowley. And in turn, the deceased Satanist Adrian Marcato, referred to in Ira Levin's Rosemary Baby, is likewise a Crowley-like figure. Long after his death, Crowley is still being used for similar purposes, appearing as a main character in Robert Anton Wilson's Masks of the Illuminati and Jake Arnott's 2009 novel The Devil's Paintbrush. The association of Crowley's name with various satanic or dark individuals occurs widely in published works, especially those oriented toward a younger but technologically literate demographic target audience. In the cyberpunk novel Hammerjack, author Mark Giller introduces the Crowleys on the second page of that sci-fi thriller as one of the groups of street species inhabiting the cities. The long-running American TV series Supernatural also includes a major character named Crowley, who plays key roles in dealing with evil forces. The acclaimed comic book author Alan Moore, himself a practitioner of ceremonial magic, has also included Crowley in several of his works. In Moore's From Hell, he appears in a cameo as a young boy declaring that magic is real, while in the series Promethea he appears several times existing in a realm of the imagination called the Immateria. Moore has also discussed Crowley's associations with the Highbury area of London in his recorded magical working, The Highbury Working. Other comic book writers have also made use of him, with Pat Mills and Oliver Ledroit portraying him as a reincarnated vampire in their series Requiem Chevalier Vampire. Crowley also is referenced in the Batman comic Arkham Asylum, a serious house on Sirius Earth, where the character Amadeus Arkham meets with him, discuss the symbolism of Egyptian tarot, and they play chess. He has also appeared in Japanese media, such as D. Gray Man and Toro Majutsu, No Index, as well as the hentai series Bible Black, where he has a fictional daughter named Jodie Crowley, who continues her father's search for the Scarlet Woman. He is also depicted in the original PlayStation game Nightmare Creatures as a powerful demonic resurrection of himself. Ian Fleming used Crowley as a model for Le Sheriff, villain in the first James Bond novel, Casino Royale. Crowley has been an influence for a string of popular musicians of the 20th century. The hugely popular band The Beatles included him as one of the many figures on the cover sleeve of their 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, where he is situated between Sri Yuksawar-Jiri and Mae West. A more intense interest in Crowley was held by Jimmy Page, the guitarist and co-founder of 1970s rock band Led Zeppelin. Despite not describing himself as a Thelemite or being a member of the Ordo Templi Orientis, Page was still fascinated by Crowley and owned some of his clothing, manuscripts, and ritual objects, and during the 1970s bought Boleskine House, which also appears in the band's movie The Song Remains the Same. On the back cover of the Doors' 13 album, Jim Morrison and the other members of the Doors are shown posing with a bust of Aleister Crowley. Author Paulo Coelho introduced the writings of Crowley to Brazilian rocker Raul Seixas, who went on to write and perform songs that were strongly influenced by Crowley. The later rock musician Ozzy Osbourne released a song titled Mr. Crowley in his solo album Blizzard of Oz, while a comparison of Crowley and Osbourne in the context of their media portrayals can be found in the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture. Crowley has also been a favorite of Swiss avant-garde metal band Celtic Frost, and the song Os Abysmi Vel Death from Monotheist is based partially on some of his writings. In the early 1990s, British indie band 530 carried with them on tour a front door which they alleged had belonged to Crowley. The door was placed prominently on stage during their gigs. Let's see. Crowley also had an influence in cinema. In particular, he was a major influence and inspiration to the work on the radical avant-garde underground filmmaker Kenneth Anger, especially his Magic Lantern Cycle series of works. Bruce Dickinson, singer with Iron Maiden, wrote the screenplay of Chemical Wedding. The Hermetic Chemical Wedding. We'll be going into that later, which features Simon Callow as Aliverhado, the name taken from the magician villain character in the Somerset Maugham book The Magician, who was in turn inspired by Maugham's meeting with Crowley. He also appeared as himself in the animated television show The Venture Brothers, in a Season 3 episode entitled Orb. The Italian historian of esotericism Giardo Berti, in his book Tarocchi di Aleister Crowley, quotes a number of literary works and films inspired by Crowley's life and legends. Some of the films are The Magician, Night of the Demon, The Devil Rides Out, from the eponymous thriller by Dennis Wheatley, also Dance to the Music of Time by Anthony Powell, Black Easter by James Blish, and The Winged Bull of Dion. Alright, that was all from Wikipedia. Next, we're going to read an article by Daniel Budillion, the 15th of August 2003, entitled Aleister Crowley's Lom and the Little Grey Men. And we talked about Lom at the end of the first episode of the UFO series. So if you needed a kind of a recap of the connection, it'd be good if you listened to that. But anyways, let's get into it. And before we get into it, there's a note, an author's note, before the article, and it says, the author is not an expert on Satanism or Crowleyism, nor is a member of any such groups or affiliated with any such groups. This report presupposes two very outlandish things: that there are aliens, and that some people, occultists, have magical powers. It is not the point of this report to prove whether or not there are such beings or powers. What is known is that there are people who believe that there are such things and believe that they have such powers. The crux of this report is based on what people believe, which may be very different from the way things really are. Please bear this in mind. This report also recounts some very curious behavior on the part of a number of people. These behaviors and events actually did take place and are fact. However, the supposed results of these events are entirely subjective and entirely in the realm of belief. It is not my purpose to try to prove or disprove the beliefs of the people involved. It's what they did and do because of these beliefs that interest me. I first became curious about a possible connection between the gray aliens of popular UFO culture and the activities of certain occultists after seeing several of UFO investigator Ray Fowler's books on the recommended reading list of a satanic website. In an idle moment, I had done a Google search on Ray's book, The Watchers 2, and one of the spots that listed it, much to my surprise, was a recommended reading list of the satanic group. And this is like anyway, this is Dan Badillion, the author of the article, speaking. Ray, with 5 books on the Andreessen affair, you and your name have become inexorably linked with it. I find it suggestive that in the end, the same thread of buried contact memories may have run a parallel course through your life as well. Are your and Betty Andreessen Luca's experiences linked at some deeper level beyond coincidence? If so, what do you think it's all about? And where do you think it's all going? In which Ray Fowler replies, I don't know. I do know that I was attracted to her case not only because Dr. Hynek referred it, but also because she is a Christian. Initially, I was interested in how a Christian would process an abduction experience. Also, and importantly, it was my exposure to her childhood contact and abduction experiences that once again triggered memories of similar childhood experiences and my future exploration of them. Along the way, there have been a number of parallel coincidences, including our receiving the typical scoop remarks during the same week and told by the entities that they were going to do something important for mankind. I found this both disturbing and inexplicable. For what reason would a UFO book be included in this curriculum of a satanic group, and why Ray's book in particular? I emailed Ray and asked him if he had any insight into the situation, but he was as perplexed as I was, and their matters rested for a year or so until additional information came into my hands. Information that may indicate, much as John Keel himself believed, the Mothman prophecies, that occult activity may be an ingredient of the gray alien mystery. The pictures below bear a resemblance and may hold the key. The first picture is a drawing made by occultist Aleister Crowley of an entity he had invoked repeatedly in 1918 and called Lam. The second picture is a composite drawing by Anne Duranger, contact of the fifth kind in Brogno, of an alien type reported throughout 1980s in the Hudson Valley. Having noticed the similarity, I proceeded to investigate the connection. It is the purpose of this report to investigate a similarly and possible connection and particularly answer the question, for what reason would a UFO book be included in the curriculum of a satanic group, and why Ray Fowler's book The Watchers 2 in particular? The Englishman, Aleister Crowley, was one of the most notorious occultists of his day and perhaps of modern times. Self-styled as the Beast 666, he went out of his way to live up to it with his sensationalism and self-promotion. He wrote a number of textbooks on ceremonial magic, most of which are in still print today. He also founded and was head of a number of occult fraternities. In short, he exerted a significant influence on occult circles that has continued to grow dramatically long after his death. In January through March of 1918, Crowley began a series of magical workings called the Amalantra workings in furnished rooms in Central Park West, New York City. These were performed via sexual and ceremonial magic, with the intent to invoke certain intelligences to physical manifestation, or bring them into our reality. In actuality, the workings typically manifested as a series of visions and communications received through the mediumship of his partner, Roddy Minor. Be that as it may, at least one such intelligence was brought into physical manifestation via the magical portal they created. The entity that came through is the one pictured above left, and I'll have pictures for this too, I should anyway, but it's the drawing of Lam. Crowley maintained the picture is actually a portrait and drawn from real life. This entity either called itself Lam or was named Lam by Crowley. Either way, he considered it to be of interdimensional origin, which was the term then for extraterrestrial. In communications with Lam, the symbolism of the egg featured prominently. Crowley included the portrait of Lam in his Dead Souls exhibition held in Greenwich Village, New York in 1919. In that same year, it was published as a frontispiece labeled The Way to Crowley's Commentary to Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence. Beneath the picture was the following inscription: Lam is the Tibetan word for way or path, and Lama is he who goeth, the specific title of the gods of Egypt, the treader of the path. In Buddhistic phraseology, its numerical value is 71, the number of this book, or possibly 72. Other than this, there is no commentary extant from Crowley upon the subject of Lam except for material published by disciples, such as Kenneth Grant. Interestingly, Crowley gave the drawing to Grant in 1945. Since Crowley's time, several occult groups and individuals following in his footsteps have claimed to have intentionally and successfully contacted Lam. Most notably, Michael Burchio in the 1960s, followed by a group of OTO initiates in the 1970s. These individuals considered Lam to be a transmundane or extraterrestrial entity and claimed remarkable success in their invocations, if they are to be believed. Following the success of these contacts, interest in occult circles, especially Crowleyan ones, gathered considerable steam. In 1987, Kenneth Grant, the generally acknowledged successor to Crowley, went so far as to formalize the Lam workings into something called the Cult of Lam. To quote from Grant's Typhonian OTO website, the Cult of Lam has been founded because very strong intimations have been received by Aosik or Aowas, to the effect that the portrait of Lam, the original drawing of which was given by 666 to 718, under curious circumstances, is the present focus of an extraterrestrial and perhaps transplutonic energy which the OTO is required to communicate at this critical period. For we have now entered the 80s mentioned in the Book of the Law. It is our aim to obtain some insight not only into the nature of LOM, but also into the possibilities of using the egg as an astral space capsule for traveling to LOM's domain, or for exploring extraterrestrial spaces in the sense in which OTO tantric time travelers are exploring the tunnels of Set in intracosmic and Chthonian capsules. Members of the OTO who feel strongly attracted to this cult of LOM are invited to apply for participation therein. It is only open to order members. It should be understood that proficiency in the magical formula of this cult does not necessarily comport eligibility for advancement in the OTO, its parent order. Concurrently, a manuscript called the LOM Statement was circulated among OTO initiates with a view to regularizing the mode of rapport and constructing a magical formula for establishing communication with LOM. Who is LOM? It is interesting to note that since Crowley's time, in occult terms at least, LOM is considered a class of entity rather than an individual being. When one invokes LOM, they are invoking an entity of that type, rather than a specific being. For occultists operating along OTO lines, the idea is to invoke these LOM entities through magical portals, intentionally created rents in time and space, into physical manifestation on planet Earth. Why this is desirable is not always so clearly stated. Michael Bertio, a LOM contactee and invoker of note, viewed LOM as the subterranean burgeoning of Lucifer Gnosis. Considering that Gnosis means an intuitive knowing, this would mean that knowing LOM is to know a welling up from the unconscious of an inner knowing of Lucifer. The occult being the occult, it is important to bear in mind that occultists at least may not necessarily see Lucifer as the devil, but rather as a light bringer who fell to earth. Yeah. So like Prometheus, we'll get into the difference between the Satan and Lucifer at a later show, but anyways. Berthiaud goes on to say that LOM is the natural mode of human evolution in the present aeon, indicating that to him and his followers, this Lucifer Gnosis is the appropriate path of human spiritual growth at this time. Crowley termed the intentional cultivation of spiritual growth the great work, and the great work for Crowley, quote, involved precisely the establishment of contact with non-human intelligences such as LOM. Using the language of Crowley's time, certain non-human intelligences, such as LOM, were what we today would term extraterrestrial. It is generally agreed within occult circles that Crowley intentionally opened a portal of entry via magic ritual in the Amalantra workings, which allowed the likes of LOM and other similar entities a passageway onto the Earth world. The rift, in between the spaces of the stars, created by the Amalantra working, created a gateway through which LOM and other extra-cosmic influences could enter the known universe, and most particularly our Earth world. According to occultists involved in such things, the portal has since widened. According to occult lore, the portal was further enlarged by a jet propulsion laboratory founder and rocket fuel scientist named Jack Parsons, and Scientology and Dianetics founder L. Ron Hubbard in 1946, facilitating, as it is said, a monumental paradigm shift in human consciousness. This magical working was called the Babylon working, and like the Amalantra working on which its ritual was patterned, it was based on ceremonial sex magic. Together, they endeavored to incarnate a physical aspect of Babylon, the Scarlet Woman of the Book of Revelation. They believed that Babylon was the herald of the new age of Horus, and that Revelations was the understandably negative interpretation by those of the dying age of Osiris. And you should have a faint, at least a sort of idea of the Horus and the Osiris thing from the Osiris, Isis, and Horus show. But anyways, let's get back into it. The gist of it was that Parsons decided to take the spirit of Babylon, the whore of Babylon, and invest it in a human being. The idea was to create a child in the spiritual world and then call down the spiritual baby and direct it into a human womb. When born, this child would incarnate the forces of Babylon, which they considered to be a good thing. Although Crowley had previously written the somewhat hilarious book Moonchild concerning a similar experiment, he wrote in a letter, "Apparently Parsons and Hubbard or somebody is producing a Moonchild. I get fairly frantic when I contemplate the idiocy of these louts." In any event, the rites were duly performed as written from January 4th to 15th of that year. It is not known if a spiritual child was enwombed from them. What is known is that the magical portal first created by Crowley, and which originally let Lom into the earth world, was re-established with considerable intensity by Parsons and Hubbard. From the diaries of the participants, it is clear that they were not as adept as Crowley in the closings of portals. What they seem to have accomplished was the drastic enlargement and ripping of an existing magical portal and the subsequent non-closure of it. Perhaps the rip they created was not possible to close. In any event, the modern UFO era began exactly a year and a half later on June 24th, 1947, with Kenneth Arnold's sighting over the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. The gray aliens, slight-bodied, big-headed, large dark-eyed mannequin creatures, are primarily an American phenomena, and it is interesting to note that all of the LOM workings were done in America. Reports of these UFO-associated entities became prevalent in the 80s and made the big time with Whitley Strieber's book Communion. The Greys appear eerily similar to LOM, with the exception of LOM not having the large insectoid wraparound eyes reported of the Greys. However, there are variations of these small mannequins that very much resemble a LOM. This entity is a composite of a variation commonly seen in the 80s. Rather than gray, its skin tone is clay white, and the facial features are different. In fact, the resemblance to the LOM pictured by Crowley is virtually exact. Also, and perhaps more significantly, Kenneth Grant, head of the current OTO, states that LOM is a great old one, whose archetype is recognizable in accounts of UFO occupants. It would seem from this official Typhonian statement that the current invokers of LOM are absolutely clear that LOM and the gray aliens are one. I am not an expert on Satanism, nor do I intend to be. However, there are some reasonably obvious things I have gleaned. First, Satanism is not a unified movement like Christianity or Islam. It is comprised of individuals with their own distinct ideas about what it means to be a Satanist. Second, to some it is a religion, to some a philosophy, to others a magical path. Third, there is usually a thread of magical interest in most Satanists of most types. And then, where there is an interest in magic among Satanists, it is almost universally an interest in Crowleyan-derived magic. The question that initiated this investigation and report were, what possible connection is there between the gray aliens of popular UFO culture and the activities of certain occultists, and for what reason would a UFO book be included in the curriculum of a satanic group, and why Ray Fowler's book, The Watchers 2, in particular? Based on face value of the evidence, a theory would be constructed that not only are the LOMs gray aliens, but that the arrival of the gray aliens in American UFO culture was facilitated solely by the magical workings of Aleister Crowley and later disciples working in his footsteps. There are no official OTO groups today, such as the Cult of LOM, that are dedicated to invoking the LOM entities in the Earth world. According to their literature, not only is contact with non-human entities an integral component of spiritual growth, but the LOM consciousness of Lucifernosis is the natural mode of human evolution in the present aeon. Thus, these gray alien LOM entities are deemed worthy of invocation into the Earth world on behalf of the interests of humanity's evolution. Now, any studier into the UFO field should be, thinking, what the hell is going on here? Because it seems very close to the Crowley's LOM seems very close at this point to the alien abduction experience with the Greys, and that they're always here to help better us and lead us into the next stages of human evolution, stuff like that. According to the face value of the evidence, one could also theorize that the magical portal that Crowley created in the Amalantra working brought through the first of these beings. However, the portal constructed was properly closed. In contrast, when Parsons and Hubbard did their similarly constructed Babylon working, involving the opening of the same portal, either they ripped the portal beyond ability to be repaired and closed, or it was enlarged beyond their ability to close it. In either case, the portal, according to the evidence, has remained opened ever since to all manner of interdimensional entities to ingress upon the Earth world at will. The Parsons Hubbard working effectively opened the world to the modern UFO entity situation, and, based on the Lucifer Gnosis construct, OTO-style occultists have continued to pull further interdimensional entities through this rip or unclosable portal. Of course, Kenneth Grant's statement noted above, Lom is a great old one whose archetype is recognizable in accounts of UFO occupants, is the final proof that the Crowleyan occultists fully believe that they are indeed invoking gray aliens into the Earth world. Noted UFO Fortean researcher and author John Keel felt that much of the paranormal situations he investigated, such as the Mothman, were at root due to occult activity of some sort, and it looks like he was onto something. Interestingly, part of the ritual for invoking Lom or Loms is to begin by meditating on the eyes of Crowley's Lom portrait. To gaze into the eyes of this entity is to invite potent contact. One feels an immediate sensation of lightness, of weightlessness, and then a sensation of falling, or being sucked into a vortex. Sound familiar? It is well known among UFO investigators that the eyes of the gray aliens have a powerful effect on the witness. Witnesses often feel like they are being sucked into their eyes. They also invoke deep feelings of fear. Grant continues with instructions. The eyes will enlarge and will suck in your consciousness until there arises a sensation of being within the entity's head. In any event, the first gate of consciousness is obviously through the eyes, and thus one who would meditate upon the eyes of a portrait of such an entity will indeed begin the process of opening a portal within themselves to the entity. In other words, you don't have to be a trained occultist to raise hell in yourself, which is also one of Keel's contentions. Why would Ray Fowler's Watcher series be recommended by Satanists as part of the curriculum? First, most Satanists... Well, I guess I already read this. Summary. Alright, I'll go back. Fourth, Loms are the occult label for gray aliens. The most comprehensive books on the habits and idiosyncrasies of the Greys are Ray Fowler's Watcher series. If you want to know all about the Greys or Lom, you read Fowler. Gray aliens are Loms. This is a summary. Gray aliens are Loms and were first contacted via magical ritual by Aleister Crowley. Further magical ritual along similar lines created a situation where direct access for these entities to the Earth world was established. Certain groups and people believe this to be beneficiary to humanity, and continue to draw these beings into the Earth world through magical ritual via the original access point. Satanists are involved in Crowleyan Lom invocations and recommend Ray's books for their extensive content on the habits and idiosyncrasies of the Loms. It is now clear why Ray Fowler's book were recommended reading. This part of the puzzle, and the primary reason I wrote the report, has been solved to my satisfaction. The secondary question raised by investigating the first is a far different matter. People's actions are objective, but the motivations are based on the subjectivity of beliefs. What one person believes to be reality may not be in the least real to another. At a certain level, and for the purposes of this report, it does not really matter if these beings and powers are objectively real or not. What is significant and of pertinence here is that many members of the occult community do indeed believe these things and powers to be real, and govern themselves accordingly. They spend considerable time attempting communication and invocation of them. They believe it is for the benefit of us all, although if this were generally known, I would think it would be a point of some considerable debate. And according to OTO Chief Kenneth Grant, here are some characteristics of Lom. Lom is known to be a link between the star systems of Sirius and Andromeda, the dog star Sirius, Isis star. Lom is the gateway to the void. Its number, 71, is that of no thing, or an apparition. Lom is a great old one, whose archetype is recognizable in accounts of UFO occupants. Lom has been invoked to fulfill the work set afoot by Ayahuasca. Lom is the transmitter to Al of the vibrations of La via Ma, the key to the Aeon of Mayat. Lom is the occult energy beaming the vibrations of Mayat and may proceed from that future Aeon. And again, note, the author is not an expert on Satanism or Crowleyism, nor is a member of any such group or affiliated with any such groups. The author has no interest in corresponding on these subjects. If you have questions on these subjects, please refer them elsewhere. And that was again written by Daniel Bedulian. Anyways, that was Aleister Crowley, and if you really want to know or study Aleister Crowley, I would just suggest just reading his books. They're pretty deep, whatever. And always remember, take them with a slight sense of humor. But yeah, I mean, it's Mystery Babylon continued. You should be fairly in tune with some of these subjects if you've listened to the other occult religion series. But anyways, that's it. Later.